Hi there. Our top story on Indian Express Opinion Videos is about the much-awaited gross domestic product data, which is finally out. And it seems that the GDP figures for the last quarter of 2016-17 isn't that good. It's 6.1%. But the overall data is still being pegged at 7.1%. To explain this big story and to break it down, I have with me Anil Shashi, the business editor of Indian Express. Anil, break it down for us.
So the numbers for the full year, this is the second estimate, and that's come in at 7.1%, which is in line, almost exactly in line with what was projected by the CSO earlier, which was also 7.1%.
The CSO is the Central
Statistical Organization Office. Yeah. So the full year numbers come in at the same level as what was estimated earlier, but the blip that we can see is on the quarter 4 numbers, the Jan to March quarter. Right. Where there's been a sharp dip in the GDP numbers, which clocked in at 6.1%.
So now last year, exactly a year ago, this was about 8%, wasn't it? So which means, can you say then that the direct impact of the demonetization which took place on the 8th of November can now finally be seen?
It evidently seems so, because the earlier estimate that the CSO had released, they had made it abundantly clear that they have not factored in the impact of the demonetization. Mm-hmm. So this is the first estimate that we have, which somewhat records the possible impact that it would have had on gross domestic output. In some sense, it also means that this number could have been much worse if they had not done a revision of the IIP and the WPI, the Index of Industrial Production, and the Wholesale Price Index.
But Anil, are you worried? Are you worried that the Indian economy is losing its steam? After all, Prime Minister Modi came to power 3 years ago on the Sabka Saath Sabka Vikas slogan, where he promised to lift all boats. And what do you think is happening now, 3 years later?
Look, at 7.1%.
Which is the overall figure?
Which is the overall figure. India still continues to be the fastest growing developing economy in the world. It's higher than China. Okay. China clocked in at 6.7% last year. And the first quarter numbers, the Jan to March numbers, were at 6.9%. So for the full year, China might be between 6.8, 6.9, which will be lower than what it has been for India. Right. So that is one thing that I think people who are watching the Indian economy would take note of. The other thing is that the demonetization impact was a one-off impact, but it had a devastating hit on the smaller segments, the unorganized part of Indian business, which in some sense has been sort of factored in. And now you might not really have such a major impact going forward. But
explain to us, Anil, that the unorganized or the informal sector actually constitutes about 89 to 90% of the economy. Is that correct?
More than 75%, definitely, yeah.
It's how much is it? 75 or is it 85? More than 75. But can you say that it's about 85 or 90, because that's what some figures are, or you're not that?
The data on the unorganized segment is very fudgy. Okay. So you don't really have a very close approximation of how much it is.
So what are you driving at? Are you driving at the fact that the data itself isn't complete, and that in a sense that these GDP figures are based on data which is only 10 or 11% of, and then you're projecting for the entire economy from 10 or 11%.
Right. So for the unorganized segment, you have data coming in only with a gap of 5 years. Mm-hmm. So essentially what we are doing is using the IIP and then extrapolating it. And the IIP essentially stands for the organized segment of the...
Which is about 10 to 12% of the economy.
About 10 to 12%, which essentially implies factories that employ more than 10 people.
So you're extrapolating data that you've got from 10 to 12% of the economy to 100% of the economy.
Till the time the 5-yearly data comes in.
So you don't really know what's going on in the Indian economy.
So the impact of demonetization on the unorganized segment really cannot be fathomed by the data that we have at this given point in time. It will be updated further as and when they get it. But at this point in time, even with the data that we have, which is the IIP data, which essentially is an extrapolation of the organized segment businesses and the impact on the unorganized segment, we still see a blip, which is in some sense revealing.
So the unorganized or the informal sector continues to be vulnerable, do you think? So 80 or 85% of the economy is living on the edge, would you say?
Look, the sudden pull out of the currency, and essentially this is the segment that deals entirely in cash, and the pull out of the currency has had a big impact across, say, the smaller segments. You look at the brassware in Moradabad, you look at leather in Agra, these are the kind of segments that would have been hurt, and that to the smaller players among these people. And to know what is the exact impact, we probably have to wait for the data to stream.
Okay, a quick last question, Anil. The World Bank report a few days ago said that if women were much more took much greater part in the economy, then I think the data figures would be at least 1% higher.
That's true, and that's true if you look at the data for China. The Chinese manufacturing has partly to do with the participation of women in the workforce, which is not there in India, or to a much.
Why not?
Look, there are cultural issues. In China, women will not mind staying in dormitories far away from their houses and work. In India, women mostly.
And there is a Communist Party that pushes them to do so. In India, you don't have that.
True, that could be one aspect. But women generally don't travel outside their villages and stay far away. They tend to prefer traveling from their place of residence to the factory, which means a lot of time lost during travel, which means women generally pulling out when they're pregnant or when they start their family. So there are lots of cultural issues, and certainly participation of women is definitely going to perk up the manufacturing.
Thank you, Anil, for painting this very beautiful and complex picture of the Indian economy. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. That's all for now.